Thank you very much. Probably the most astonishing thing about Liszt's concert career is that at the age of 35, at the height of his fame, he quite abruptly walked away from it all and accepted a long-standing invitation to become Kapellmeister at the quiet little town of Weimar. Liszt later told one of his pupils, Alexander Siloti, that he was proud of having been the only pianist to give up performing at the right time. People always told me I should have gone on playing, Liszt once said, but if I'd gone on playing, people would soon be telling me I needed to retire. Besides which, Liszt wanted more time for composing. And as it turned out, Liszt was not unlike the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould, who also gave up performing at the age of 32, but whereas Glenn Gould left the concert stage to concentrate on recording, Liszt kept on working with other musicians and spent his time teaching and conducting and very much remained part of the social musical world, you might say. Now, I said that Liszt was interested in pinning down a specific Hungarian style of music. This was at a moment in history when there was a great spirit of nationalism that was slowly awakening across Europe. Since the two world wars and what happened in between, the idea of nationalism has kind of gotten an ugly connotation. But you have to understand again that at this point in history, none of that had happened yet. What was sort of current at that time is that, right about the time that Liszt was 3 or 4 years old, the great powers of Europe had finally succeeded in kicking Napoleon off the world stage for good. And with Napoleon out of the way, the recently reestablished ruling classes were at varying degrees out of touch with the common folk of Europe. And the common folk of Europe were varying degrees of fed up. Now, had they realized their common ground, there would have been hell to pay for the ruling classes. But as is so often the case, there were just deep divisions of not just interests, but ideals. And these divisions were played by the more wily and savvy of the people in power to their great advantage. For one thing, some of the common folk were mainly interested in autonomy. That is to say, we don't mind having a king, we just want our king. We don't want random dude halfway across the continent who doesn't know us and our culture. Other people were looking for democratic reforms, so expansion of the suffrage, civil liberties, etc. Still others were mainly interested in relief from poverty, so redistribution in some form or another. And these different ideals and interests were not always in alignment with each other, or could be easily satisfied together. Not only that, there were class divisions. You had what you might call the lower upper classes. You had the peasants, you had the industrial workers, you had the students. And each of these classes tended to make rather unfounded assumptions about how, if there were a revolution, they would be the natural leaders and the other classes would naturally and willingly follow them. The result of all these frustrations and misunderstandings was that there were a whole bunch of revolutions that broke out across Europe in 1848 and 1849, and these were put down rather quickly with great loss of life. And as it turned out, quite a lot of the reforms that people were looking for ended up coming about anyway later on in that century by other means. Now, Hungary is an interesting case, Liszt's native Hungary. It was technically at that time an autonomous kingdom, but it was being held in trust basically by the Austrian Habsburg Empire. And the Austrians, for their part, were quite happy to enforce laws that had been passed in Vienna, but ignore the laws that had been passed in Pest. And the Hungarians were, as you can imagine, not terribly happy about this. So when a revolt broke out in Vienna in 1848, the Hungarians took advantage of the opportunity to make a whole series of demands for reforms from the Habsburgs, which they had no choice but to grant. Unfortunately, at that point, the Hungarians kind of split over where to go from there. And they fell into basically the moderates who wanted gradual reform through legislation, and the revolutionaries who wanted nothing short of outright independence immediately, even if it meant armed revolt. And as it turned out, but they were forced into armed revolt because the Austrians fairly quickly regretted having made so many promises and went back on their promises. To make a long story short, the Hungarians actually made pretty significant military headway against the Austrians, but then the Austrians, desperate for help, called in the Russians. And then the Hungarian Revolution collapsed pretty quickly, partly because of overwhelming Russian military force, but also because there was one particular Hungarian general who kind of went rogue and started disobeying orders and got a little too cozy to the enemy. With the revolution having been put down, the Austrians appointed a rather sadistic military governor who gleefully executed a lot of the Hungarian leaders, both revolutionaries and moderates. So that's the short story of what happened. Now, where in all of this was Franz Liszt? Now, back in 1830, when Liszt had been a teen in Paris, there had been a whole bunch of student uprisings and worker uprisings, and Liszt joined in those demonstrations quite eagerly, and he was out there marching with protesters and chanting slogans and cheering people on the barricades. And he even wrote a piano piece titled Lyon in honor of a particular workers' uprising that happened in that city a couple of years later. And all his life, Liszt was an ardent champion of humanitarian causes and oppressed peoples the world over. The thing is that also by the year 1848, Liszt had seen enough of the world to realize that revolutions can and often do end up changing the world for the worse. And while we know from his private correspondence that he was, of course, on the side of Hungary against Austria, his sympathies lay with the moderates. And his misgivings about the revolution, unfortunately, turned out to be all too justified because of the bloodbath that ensued. But because of his misgivings, Liszt refrained from making any public comment during the Hungarian Revolution. And this raised a lot of eyebrows. I mean, here's one of Hungary's great patriots. Why is he silent? And he came in for quite a bit of criticism for his silence. Most notably, the poet and polemicist Heinrich Heine wrote a rather snarky poem where he accused Liszt of cowardice. And the poem goes something like, Franz Liszt is safe from harm, while Hungary's youth lies bleeding on the battlefield. The great Franz will live to be old and tell the tale of his valiant deeds. Never mind that Heinrich Heine was not on the battlefield either. This was just the 1800s equivalent of politicians and pundits insulting each other on Twitter. But if you want to know how Liszt really felt about the Hungarian Revolution, you should look no further than this next piece. This is titled Funérailles, October 1849. Now, just by coincidence, Liszt's old friend, or possibly frenemy, Frederick Chopin, had died that same month. And because of the timing coincidence, and also because there's a central section in this piece that sounds rather like the central section in the Chopin Heroic Polonaise, a lot of people have assumed that this was meant to be an elegy for Chopin. But Liszt was quite explicit about this. This is an elegy for the fallen leaders of Hungary, and it's also, more broadly, an elegy for fallen freedom fighters everywhere, and for the ideals which perish when there are no heroes left to fight for them. Funérailles by Franz Liszt.